The groan of tortured metal was a sound Silas Miller knew better than his own heartbeat. It was the sound of his whole world threatening to tear itself apart, right in the middle of the best stand of soybeans he'd ever grown. The old John Deere 55 combine, a machine born the same year he was, shuddered violently, the rhythmic chugging of its Hercules Flathead 6 giving way to a sickening grinding clatter. He slammed the variable speed lever back and killed the ignition, the sudden silence of the October afternoon pressing in on him, broken only by the ticking of the cooling manifold and the rustle of dry bean pods in the breeze. He climbed down from the operator's platform, his boots sinking into the rich black Iowa soil. A plume of blue-gray smoke curled up from the side of the machine, carrying the acrid smell of burnt oil and hot steel. He knew what it was before he even got the side panel off, the main bearing on the threshing cylinder. Again. He'd babied it, greased it every 4 hours, listened to its song for the slightest change in pitch. But the old girl was just plain tired. A cloud of dust on the gravel road announced his neighbor's arrival before the sound of the engine did. It wasn't just any engine. It was the deep, turbocharged whistle of a brand-new John Deere 4430, its sound guard cab gleaming in the autumn sun like a green and yellow jewel. Frank Gable sat up there in his air-conditioned perch, a smug look on his face that Silas had come to know and despise. Frank slowed his tractor to a crawl, the massive duals on the rear barely disturbing the gravel. He idled down, the diesel engine settling into a confident, powerful rumble that made Silas's dead machine feel like a relic from another age. "Trouble, Miller?" Frank yelled, his voice muffled slightly by the thick glass of his cab. He didn't bother to get out. Silas wiped a greasy hand on his already stained jeans. "She's just resting her eyes," he called back, forcing a calm he didn't feel. Every hour of daylight was precious. Every hour of downtime was a bushel of beans lost to the coming rains. Frank chuckled, a short barking sound. "That thing belongs in a museum, Silas, not a field. My new 6600 would have this whole section done by supper. You're trying to fight a war with a musket." He gestured with his thumb back towards his own farm. "The bank's practically giving money away right now. 5% interest. You could trade that whole scrap pile of yours in and be running new iron by next spring. You can't make money saving it." Silas just stared at the smoking combine. His father's words echoed in his head, as clear as if the old man were standing right beside him. "Debt is a yoke, son. You put it on your own neck, and the banker holds the reins. You pay cash, or you do without." His father had farmed this same land through the Depression with a team of mules and a Farmall F20 he'd bought with 3 years of saved cash. He died with the deed to the farm free and clear in his desk drawer, and not a single penny owed to any man. That was the legacy Silas was trying to uphold. "I'm doing all right, Frank," Silas said, his voice tight. "All right?" Frank laughed again, louder this time. "You're drowning, and you think you're just treading water. Look around you, man. It's 1972. The whole world is hungry for our corn and beans. Nixon's opening up trade. Earl Butz is telling us to plant fence row to fence row. This is the time to get big or get out. You and that old junk. You're getting out, one breakdown at a time." With a final pitying shake of his head, Frank throttled up the 4430. The turbo spooled up with a satisfying whine, and he pulled away, leaving Silas in a cloud of dust and the heavy silence of his own failure. The truth was, Frank's words stung because they had the ring of truth to them. All around the county, farmers were trading up. They were buying bigger tractors, wider implements, 6-row combines. They were taking on debt like it was a badge of honor, a sign of their ambition and faith in the future. And here he was, with his father's paid-for 160 acres, a 1951 Farmall M, and a combine that had just eaten its own guts for the 3rd time this season. He spent the rest of the afternoon on his back in the bean stubble, wrenches in hand. The bearing was shot, just as he'd thought. It had seized and spun in its housing, galling the shaft and ruining the pillow block. It wasn't a simple fix. It was a major surgery, and he didn't have the parts. He'd have to pull the whole cylinder, haul it back to his workshop, and hope he could either build up the shaft with his welder and turn it down on the lathe, or find a machine shop that could do it before the snow flew. As the sun bled out across the western horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, Silas finally got the heavy cylinder unbolted. He sat there, covered in grease and dirt, his knuckles bloody, and looked at his hands. They were his father's hands. Calloused, scarred, capable. His father had taught him how to weld, how to read a micrometer, how to listen to an engine and diagnose its troubles by sound alone. A farmer who can't fix his own equipment, the old man used to say, is just a renter on his own land, paying his dues to the dealership. Frank was right about one thing. It was a war. But Silas didn't see it as a war against the market or the weather. He saw it as a war against the yoke of debt. Every repair he made with his own two hands, every dollar he didn't have to borrow, was a battle won. He looked at the broken machine, not with despair, but with a grim resolve. He would fix it. He would get his crop in. He would not break his father's first and only commandment, "Owe no man." Now, before we go any further into this story, into the long winters in the workshop and the summers in the field, I want to ask you all a question. Put yourself in Silas's boots, right there in that bean field in 1972. You've got the new tractor dealer on one side, offering you shiny, reliable equipment on what seems like easy credit, and the ghost of your father on the other, telling you that debt is a trap. What would you have done? Would you have signed the papers and taken the loan for the new combine, or would you have hauled that old cylinder back to the shop and fired up the welder? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm curious to see how many of you are cut from the same cloth as Silas Miller. That winter was a long, cold battle fought in the pale yellow light of a single bulb hanging from the rafters of his workshop. The building itself was a testament to his father's philosophy, built from salvaged barnwood and roofed with tin he'd bought for cash after a good year in the 50s. Inside, it smelled of cold steel, cutting oil, and the faint, sweet scent of cured hay from the loft above. Silas had the threshing cylinder from the John Deere 55 mounted on a set of heavy-duty sawhorses. The first step was the hardest, cleaning decades of caked-on grease, chaff and dirt from every crevice. He used a putty knife, a wire brush, and a 5-gallon bucket of kerosene, working until his hands were raw and the concrete floor was black with grime. Only then could he truly assess the damage. The shaft was worse than he'd thought. Deep grooves were scored into the hardened steel where the bearing had spun. The pillow block housing was warped from the heat. He spent 2 days just trying to source the parts. The local John Deere dealer, a young man named Peterson, who had taken over from his father, barely suppressed a smirk when Silas brought in the old parts. "Honestly, Silas," Peterson said, wiping his clean hands on a clean rag, "the cost of these parts, if I can even find them, and the machine shop labor, you'd be halfway to a down payment on a good used 4400. We just got one in on trade." "Just see if you can find the parts, Pete," Silas said, his jaw tight. The call came 2 days later. "No luck on the housing, Silas. They stopped making that casting 15 years ago. I can get you the bearings, but the shaft is a special order from a place in Moline. Gonna take 6 weeks and cost you a pretty penny." A pretty penny was something Silas didn't have. The bean crop had been good, but after paying his property taxes and buying seed and fertilizer for next year, his savings account was thin. Buying a new shaft was out of the question. Fabricating a new housing was beyond the capabilities of his modest shop. It was a checkmate. A sane man would have given up, called the scrapyard, and gone to see Peterson about that 4400. But Silas wasn't just a sane man, he was his father's son. He hauled the warped pillow block housing over to his workbench. He studied it for a long, quiet hour, turning it over and over. The problem was the bore. It was no longer perfectly round. He couldn't just press a new bearing race into it, it would fail in a matter of hours. The solution came to him in the middle of the night. He woke from a dead sleep with the image of his father's old South Bend lathe in his mind. It was a heavy, ancient machine, but it was precise. The next morning, he fired up the forge. He heated the warped housing until it glowed a dull cherry red. Then, using a set of custom-made jigs and a heavy bullpeen hammer, he carefully, painstakingly tapped the casting back into its rough original shape. After it cooled slowly in a bucket of sand to prevent cracking, he mounted it onto the faceplate of the lathe. For the next 2 days, the only sounds from the workshop were the hum of the electric motor and the high-pitched scrape of the carbide cutter taking off thousandths of an inch of steel with each pass. He was reboring the housing, making it perfectly round again, but oversized. He then spent another day on the lathe, turning a custom steel sleeve with an outer diameter that matched his new, larger bore and an inner diameter that would be a perfect press fit for the new bearing race he'd ordered from Peterson. It was slow, meticulous work. A single mistake, a single slip of the hand would turn the whole assembly into junk. He measured with his micrometers, checked and rechecked, his breath fogging in the cold air. While he waited for the new bearings to arrive, he turned his attention to the damaged shaft. He couldn't afford a new one, so he would repair the old one. He carefully cleaned the galled section with a grinder, creating a shallow, wide channel. Then he fired up his Lincoln arc welder. Using a high nickel content rod designed for building up worn shafts, he laid down bead after careful bead, slowly filling the channel he'd ground out. The key was to control the heat to avoid warping the long shaft. He'd weld for a few minutes, then peen the weld with a hammer to relieve the stress, then let it cool, measuring it constantly with a straight edge. Once the shaft was built back up, the real artistry began. He mounted it in the lathe between centers and began the long process of turning it back down to its original diameter. Shavings of steel, hot and blue, curled off the cutter. The smell filled the shop. He had to be perfect. The tolerance for the bearing seat was less than the thickness of a human hair. Day after day he worked, measuring, cutting, measuring again, until the new bearings slid onto the freshly machined surface with a satisfying snug fit. By the time February's blizzards had buried the county in a deep blanket of white, the cylinder was reassembled. The custom-made sleeve was pressed into the rebored housing. The new bearings were packed with grease. The rebuilt shaft spun true and smooth. It was stronger than it had been when it left the factory in 1952. He had spent less than $100 on bearings and welding rods. He had spent hundreds of hours of his own life. At the co-op, the talk was all about Frank Gable. He'd had a tremendous year. His new 6600 combine had chewed through his expanded acreage without a single breakdown. He'd sold his corn at the peak of the market and was already talking about buying another quarter section that was coming up for sale. He'd walk into the diner for coffee, and other farmers would gather around his table, listening to him talk about commodity futures and depreciation schedules. When Silas came in, the conversation would often die down. They looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. They saw his grease-stained fingernails, the perpetual weariness in his eyes. They saw a man clinging to the past while the future was passing him by. "Here you spent the winter tinkering with that old 55, Silas," one of them said one morning, a little too loudly. "She's ready for next fall," Silas replied, stirring his coffee. "A man's time is worth something," the farmer continued, parroting something he'd no doubt heard from Frank. "All those hours you spent in the shop, you could have been planning, expanding. You can't get ahead with a wrench in your hand." Silas just nodded and drank his coffee. He didn't try to explain. They wouldn't understand the deep satisfaction of hearing that cylinder spin perfectly, the quiet pride in knowing he depended on no one but himself. They saw a man falling behind. He saw a man standing on a foundation of solid rock while they were all building their houses on the shifting sands of bank loans and government promises. He just hoped the storm wouldn't come before he was ready. The middle years of the 1970s were like a long golden afternoon. The grain prices, driven by massive sales to the Soviet Union, stayed high. Land values in their county doubled and then doubled again. It seemed like a new era of permanent prosperity had dawned for the American farmer. The mantra from the Department of Agriculture, "Get big or get out," became the gospel. Credit was cheap, and optimism was a cash crop all its own. Frank Gable was the high priest of this new religion. He bought that quarter section and then another 80 acres after that. His operation swelled to over 800 acres, a massive spread for the time and place. To work it, he traded in the 4430 for a brand new John Deere 4630, and then, a year later, added a monstrous 4840 with front-wheel assist, a tractor so large it made the roads seem narrow. He built a new machine shed, a gleaming pole barn of steel and concrete that dwarfed Silas's old wooden workshop. Trucks from the dealership and the fuel co-op were a constant presence on the road to his farm. He didn't just buy equipment, he bought a lifestyle. He put in a swimming pool behind his house. His wife drove a new Chrysler station wagon with fake wood paneling on the sides. He took his family to Florida for 2 weeks every winter. At the diner, he'd spread out maps of his fields, talking about tiling projects and pivot irrigation systems, all financed by the Farmers and Merchants Bank. He was living the dream, and he became the model everyone else tried to emulate. More and more of the old-timers, men who had farmed alongside Silas's father, started leveraging their paid-for land to buy new equipment and rent more ground, afraid of being left behind. Silas, meanwhile, became a local curiosity, a living fossil. He kept farming his 160 acres with his old Farmall M and the rebuilt John Deere 55. The combine, after its winter surgery, ran like a top. He still had breakdowns, of course, a hydraulic line on the old tractor, a worn-out chain on the corn head, but he fixed them himself, usually with parts he had on hand or could fabricate. He was a ghost at the machinery auctions, never bidding, just watching, seeing the astronomical prices farmers were willing to pay for used equipment, shaking his head at the madness. The high grain prices were good for him too, but the extra money didn't go to new iron or a vacation. It went into the bank. He'd walk into the Farmers and Merchants, past the loan officers' desks, where his neighbors were signing papers for $100,000 lines of credit, and go to the teller's window. He'd deposit his grain checks and buy certificates of deposit, 6-month CDs, 1-year CDs, 2-year CDs. He laddered them, creating a steady stream of maturing investments. The bank manager, Mr. Abernathy, would sometimes call him into his office. Abernathy was a portly man who smelled of cigars and wore suits that were a little too tight. He had financed Frank Gable's entire empire. "Silas," he'd say, leaning back in his leather chair, "I see you've got a fair bit of capital just sitting here in these CDs. Earning a little interest, sure, but your land value has quadrupled in the last 5 years. You have a massive amount of equity just sleeping. You could leverage that. Buy the Henderson place next to you. Frank's been sniffing around it, but if you moved first, I could have the papers drawn up by Friday." "I'm not interested in more land, Mr. Abernathy," Silas would say politely. "What about equipment then? That old M of yours. It's a fine tractor, a classic. But a new 4240 with a cab and air conditioning would cut your field time in half. Think of the efficiency. The M is paid for. It doesn't burn much fuel, and I know how to fix every nut and bolt on it. I'm happy with it." Abernathy would sigh, a look of genuine bewilderment on his face. He saw Silas not as prudent, but as pathologically fearful, a man with no vision. After one such meeting, Silas overheard Abernathy talking to a loan officer as he was leaving. "Poor Miller," Abernathy said, his voice low. "His old man squeezed all the ambition out of him. He's going to die on that little 160, never knowing what he could have been." To everyone in the county, Silas looked like a failure. In an era of explosive growth, he had stood still. In a time of boundless optimism, he was a quiet pessimist. He drove a rusty pickup truck. He wore work-worn clothes. He took no vacations. He added no acres. He was a man who had been handed a golden ticket and had refused to cash it in. The scorn he'd once faced had softened into a kind of gentle pity. He was just Old Man Miller's boy, a relic of a bygone era, content to be left behind by progress. But Silas didn't feel like a failure. He felt free. When the fall rains came and his neighbors were sweating about getting their massive crops out of the field before their loan payments came due, Silas slept soundly. He had less to harvest, and if a little got left in the field, it didn't mean a frantic call from the bank. He was his own man. His fate was tied to the sun and the soil, not to interest rate tables in Des Moines or grain futures in Chicago. One crisp evening in the late autumn of 1979, Silas was finishing up his corn harvest. The old 55 chugged along faithfully, the familiar sounds a comfort to him. He was working by the headlights, the dust hanging in their beams. On the road, he saw the tail lights of Frank Gable's brand-new John Deere 8820 combine, a machine so enormous it looked like a battleship sailing across the land. It had a price tag north of $100,000. Frank was harvesting his own corn, his huge machine lit up like a city. its massive grain tank extension glowing under powerful halogen lights. It could harvest more corn in an hour than Silas could in a full day. Silas finished his last pass and shut his machine down. The silence returned. He sat there on the operator's platform, the faint rumble of Frank's diesel carrying across the fields. He wasn't envious. He felt a deep and unsettling premonition. It was a feeling in his gut, a farmer's intuition. This couldn't last. The prices, the credit, the endless growth. It was a fever, and fevers always break. Later that week, while in town for supplies, he sat in his pickup listening to the radio. The farm report was full of good news, predicting another record year. But then the national news came on. The announcer's voice was grave. He spoke of runaway inflation, an energy crisis, and a new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker, who was promising to slay the inflation dragon no matter the cost. The announcer mentioned that the prime interest rate had just been raised. Again, it was now at a staggering 15%. Silas looked across the street at the Farmers and Merchants Bank. Through the big plate glass window, he could see Frank Gable in Abernathy's office, laughing, signing another stack of papers. The foundation of solid rock felt very firm under Silas's feet, and for the first time he could feel the tremor, the first faint shudder of the earthquake that was about to bring his neighbors' houses of cards tumbling down. The first sign of the breaking fever came not from the bank, but from the sky. The summer of 1980 arrived hot and breathless. The spring rains had been sparse, and by June the corn was already curling its leaves by mid-afternoon, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. Day after day, the sun beat down from a hazy, cloudless sky. The rich black soil turned to a fine grey powder that puffed up around Silas's boots. Ponds shrank, their edges cracking into intricate mosaics of dried mud. For Silas, the drought was a hardship. For Frank Gable, it was a catastrophe in the making. His massive acreage required massive inputs. His high-yield corn varieties were thirsty, and he'd bet the farm on them. The diesel engine powering his new center pivot irrigation system on the Henderson place ran 24 hours a day. Its monotonous drone a constant, expensive reminder of the failed rains. The fuel truck was at his farm twice a week, pumping hundreds of gallons of diesel into his tanks, the price of which had nearly doubled thanks to the turmoil in the Middle East. Silas watched his own corn suffer, but his costs were minimal. His open-pollinated varieties, saved year after year, were hardier, their roots running deeper, better adapted to the local soil and its occasional cruelties. He would have a crop, not a great one, but enough to see him through. He wasn't counting on record yields to pay a banknote. Then came the second sign, this one from Washington. To protest the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the president declared an embargo on grain sales to the USSR. The market that had been the bedrock of the 1970s boom vanished overnight. The price of corn at the local co-op fell 30 cents a bushel in a single day. Then another 20 the next. A panic set in. The talk at the diner changed. The confident boasting about land values and new equipment was replaced by hushed, worried conversations about the basis, about storage costs, about when the market might recover. Frank Gable grew thin and pale. The easy smile was gone, replaced by a permanent, tight-lipped frown. Silas saw him one sweltering afternoon at the parts store. Frank's new 4840 tractor, not even 2 years old, was parked outside, a dark stain of hydraulic oil spreading on the pavement beneath it. Frank was at the counter, his voice strained. "What do you mean it's on back order?" he demanded of the young man behind the counter. "It's a hydraulic control valve. You're a John Deere dealer." "I'm sorry, Frank," the clerk said nervously. "Everybody's running their equipment hard in this heat. A lot of hydraulic failures. The warehouse in Moline is swamped. It could be 2 weeks." "2 weeks?" Frank's voice cracked. "I've got 300 acres of hay to cut. My operating loan is due. 2 weeks might as well be 2 years. He slammed his fist on the counter, turned and saw Silas standing by a rack of oil filters. Frank's eyes, bloodshot and weary, held a flicker of the old arrogance, now mixed with a desperate raw fear. "Something funny, Miller," he snapped. "No, Frank, nothing funny at all," Silas said quietly. Frank just stared at him for a moment, then stormed out of the store, the bell on the door jangling furiously behind him. The cracks were showing, not just in the parched earth, but in the very foundation of the new way of farming. The complex, powerful machines were magnificent when they ran, but they were fragile. A single $500 electronic component or a specialized hydraulic valve could render a $200,000 operation useless. And the dealers who had been so eager to sell the machines were now overwhelmed with servicing them. Farmers who had forgotten the art of the wrench were now completely at the mercy of a dealership schedule and a parts supply chain that stretched halfway across the country. That fall, Silas got his meager crop out of the field with his old 55. The rebuilt cylinder never missed a beat. He had to replace a worn-out slip clutch on the corn head, a job that took him 3 hours and cost him $30 for new friction plates. He did the work himself by the light of a kerosene lantern in his workshop. Down the road, Frank's massive 8820 combine sat idle for 4 critical days, waiting for a technician from the dealership 60 miles away to come and diagnose a problem in its complex straw walker monitoring system. 4 days of perfect weather, lost forever. The winter of 1981 was bleak. The price of corn and beans stayed in the basement. But the price of money went through the roof. Paul Volcker's war on inflation was in full swing. The prime interest rate, which had been in the single digits when Frank and the others had signed their lives away, climbed past 18, then 20, then peaked at a soul-crushing 21.5%. Operating loans that were once manageable became anchors, pulling farmers under. Mr. Abernathy was no longer the jovial town booster, handing out loans with a smile. He was a man under pressure from his own board, his face a grim mask as he made phone calls to men he'd known his whole life, telling them their variable rate loans had just reset and their payments were now double what they had been last year. The farm crisis had begun. It rolled across the heartland like a silent, invisible plague. It didn't come with thunder and lightning, but with certified letters from the bank, with auction notices tacked to the bulletin board at the courthouse. The first to go were the young guys, the ones who had started farming in the late 70s with nothing but a loan and a dream. Then it began to claim the established ones, the men who had leveraged their family farms to expand, to get big. Frank Gable fought like a cornered animal. He sold off the new 4840 at a huge loss, trying to raise cash. He let his part-time hired man go. His wife started working as a clerk at the grocery store. The swimming pool sat empty, a green, scummy film covering the water. The trips to Florida were a distant memory, but it wasn't enough. He had too many acres, too much debt. The falling land values had erased his equity. He was, in the cold, hard language of the bank, upside down. Silas survived. The low grain prices meant his income was down, but his expenses were a fraction of his neighbors. He burned less than a quarter of the fuel Frank did. He had no repair bills from the dealership. He had no loan payments. In fact, the crisis was, in a strange way, helping him. The interest rates that were destroying his neighbors were a boon for him. His laddered certificates of deposit, bought when rates were low, were now maturing and being rolled over into new CDs, earning 15, 16, 17%. The modest interest income, once a small bonus, was now a vital lifeline, covering his property taxes and living expenses, meaning every dollar from his crop could be reinvested in the farm. One blustery March afternoon, Silas was in his workshop, grinding the valves on the head of his Farmall M's engine. It was his winter ritual, a meticulous overhaul that ensured the old tractor would be ready for spring planting. He was at peace, the familiar work a meditation. He heard a truck pull into his yard. It was Frank Gable. He looked like a different man. The swagger was gone. His shoulders were slumped, and he looked 10 years older. He stood hesitantly in the doorway of the shop, twisting a greasy cap in his hands. "Silas," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Frank," Silas replied, wiping his hands on a rag and stepping forward. "The bank." "They're calling my note," Frank said, his eyes fixed on the concrete floor. "Abernathy gave me 30 days to become current, or they'll start foreclosure proceedings." He finally looked up, his eyes swimming with a despair so profound it made Silas's chest ache. "I'm going to lose it all, my dad's place, everything. They're going to have an auction." He stood there, the man who had mocked Silas's old ways, the high priest of progress, now utterly broken. He wasn't looking for a loan. He knew Silas didn't have that kind of money. Silas realized he was looking for something else. Absolution, maybe, or just a place to confess his failure to the one man who had seen it coming. "I was a fool, Silas," Frank choked out, a dry sob catching in his throat. "I listened to the bankers and the experts. Land is the one thing they're not making any more of," they said. "Leverage your assets." "I built a whole empire out of debt. I thought it was a skyscraper. Turns out it was just a house of cards. And the wind is blowing." Silas didn't say, "I told you so." The words would have been ash in his mouth. There was no victory in witnessing a man's ruin. He simply nodded. "I'm sorry to hear it, Frank, truly." Frank eventually left, shuffling back to his truck like an old man. Silas watched him drive away, then turned back to his engine. He carefully lapped the valves into their seats with grinding compound, his motions steady and sure. Each part he touched was solid, real, and paid for. Outside, the wind howled, but in the small circle of light in his workshop, all was calm. He was an island of stone in the middle of a raging sea. The auction was on a cold, grey day in early May. A raw wind whipped across the yard, snapping the flags on the auctioneer's truck and chilling the small crowd to the bone. Nearly the whole county was there, their faces grim, their hands stuffed in their pockets. They weren't there as eager buyers. They were there as mourners at a funeral. They saw Frank's life spread out on hay racks for them to pick over. His tools, his household furniture, the toys his children had played with. It was a public execution of a family's dream. Silas stood at the back of the crowd. He watched as Frank's gleaming, monstrous machines were sold off one by one, the 8820 combine, the massive disc, the 24-row planter. They sold for 50 cents on the dollar of what Frank had paid for them. The bankers from farmers and merchants stood off to the side, stone-faced, marking down the numbers in their ledgers. Frank and his wife stood on the porch of their house, watching, their faces hollowed out by grief. When the auctioneer moved to the contents of the machine shop, Silas stepped forward. Frank had always bought the best: a heavy-duty Lincoln welder, a drill press, a gleaming set of snap-on wrenches. Silas needed a better welder, and his drill press was an ancient belt-driven thing. He bid quietly, calmly, paying with cash from a thick envelope in his coat pocket. A few of his neighbors looked at him, their expressions a mixture of surprise and a newfound respect. He wasn't gloating. He was simply buying good tools at a fair price. The last thing to be sold was the land. It was offered in parcels. The expansion parcels, the ones Frank had bought during the boom, sold for less than half of what he'd paid. The bank bought them back, adding them to its growing inventory of foreclosed land. Finally, the auctioneer announced the home quarter section, the original 160 acres that Frank's father had farmed. An uneasy silence fell over the crowd. This was the heart of it all. This was the family legacy. The auctioneer started the bidding. No one spoke. No one wanted to be the one to take a man's home place. "Do I have an opening bid?" the auctioneer called, his voice echoing in the cold air. Silas felt a nudge in his soul. It was his father's voice, quiet and firm. "Oh no, man," the voice said, "but be a good neighbor." He raised his hand. "I'll bid," he said, his voice clear and steady. He named a number. It was low, the assessed value from 10 years prior, but it was a solid, real number. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. He tried to get another bid, but the crowd remained silent, their eyes on Silas. They understood. This was different. This wasn't a vulture picking at a carcass. This was something else. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking like a rifle shot. "To Silas Miller." A quiet murmur went through the crowd. Silas walked to the clerk's table and, in full view of Mr. Abernathy, pulled out his checkbook. He wrote the check for the full amount of the land, his hand not trembling in the slightest. Later, after the crowd had dispersed and the auctioneers had packed up, Silas walked over to the house. Frank was sitting on the porch steps, his head in his hands. "I guess you get to have the last laugh, Miller," Frank said without looking up, his voice thick with bitterness. "This isn't about laughing, Frank," Silas said, standing before him. "This is your father's land. It should stay with a gable." Frank looked up, his face a mask of confusion. "What are you talking about? You just bought it." "I did," Silas said, "and I'm going to need a good tenant to farm it." "I'll rent it to you. Cash rent, fair price. You can stay in the house, you can start over, no debt. Just a year-to-year lease. You make a crop, you pay the rent, you keep the rest. You can use my equipment until you get back on your feet. Frank stared at him, his mouth agape. He looked from Silas's calloused hands to his steady, clear eyes. He saw no pity, no condescension. He saw only an offer, as solid and real as the earth beneath their feet. The dam of his pride finally broke, and he wept. He wept for his foolishness, for his losses, but also for the unexpected, undeserved grace he was being shown. In the years that followed, the story of Silas Miller and Frank Gable became a local legend. The community's perspective shifted. Silas, the eccentric recluse, became a quiet pillar of wisdom. Farmers who had once mocked his old machinery now came to his workshop, hat in hand, asking for help fixing their own aging equipment, which they could no longer afford to replace. He taught them how to weld, how to fabricate parts, how to keep the old iron running. He never charged for his time, only for the materials. He was rebuilding his community, one repaired machine at a time. Frank Gable, humbled and hard-working, became Silas's most trusted partner. He farmed his old home place as a renter, slowly rebuilding his life. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet competence and a deep, abiding gratitude. Together, he and Silas weathered the rest of the 1980s. When the good times finally began to return in the 1990s, Silas was in a position no one could have imagined. As his neighbors retired or gave up, he began to expand. He never borrowed a penny. He'd wait until he had the cash from a few good harvests, and then he'd buy a neighboring farm. His operation grew, slowly, organically, built on a foundation of pure equity. He replaced his old equipment, but only when he could pay cash for good, used machines. He raised a son, teaching him everything his own father had taught him. He taught him how to listen to an engine, how to read the soil, how to respect the weather. But the most important lesson was the one about the two kinds of farmers in the world. There are those who farm the land, Silas would tell the boy, his hand resting on the warm hood of the old Farmall M, which he kept and used for light chores. And there are those who farm the bank. We farm the land, son. Never forget that. The years rolled on. The son grew into a man, with his father's quiet strength and his grandfather's hands. The farm prospered beyond anyone's wildest dreams. One bright, sunny morning in the fall of 1999, an old man and his middle-aged son walked into the gleaming, glass-fronted John Deere dealership. The young salesman, the grandson of the man who had tried to sell Silas a combine back in the 70s, greeted them with a practiced, polished smile. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, eyeing their simple work clothes. The son, a man now in his 40s, looked around at the gigantic computer-filled machines that filled the showroom. His gaze fell upon the newest model, a massive 9650 STS combine, a technological marvel that cost more than his entire town was worth in his father's youth. "We're ready to trade up," the son said. "We'll take 5 of those, the 9650s, and the 30-foot flex heads to go with them." The salesman's smile faltered. He looked from the son to the old man, who stood silently, his eyes twinkling. He thought it was a joke, some old farmers having a bit of fun at his expense. 5 of them? That was a multi-million-dollar order. No one did that. He let out a nervous chuckle. 5? That's quite a fleet. We'd need to run your financials, get an approval from corporate. The old man, Silas Miller, stepped forward. He reached into the inside pocket of his worn but clean jacket and pulled out a simple, old-fashioned checkbook. He didn't say a word. He just laid it on the salesman's polished desk. The salesman stared at the checkbook, then back at the two men. He finally understood. He wasn't looking at farmers who needed a loan. He was looking at the bank. Silas looked at his son and nodded, a lifetime of vindication in that simple gesture. He had fought his war not with new iron, but with old wisdom. He had honored his father's legacy not by clinging to the past, but by earning the future. And now he was here to pay cash.